Appreciate the invitation and opportunity to be here. So we're going to have a discussion panel about construction site fires, I should say. These tend to gather a lot of attention, in large part because they're typically some of the only fires that are still burning by the time that the news media rolls in. And so, and they tend to be quite spectacular. And so, and they also tend to be pretty significant losses. And so this is a real important opportunity to try to bring together the fire industry and the insurance industry. And that's really kind of what the focus of the panel today is going to be about, is how can we kind of break down some of those barriers to take a more joined up approach to address this risk and to really try to mitigate future losses. And so we have two wonderful panelists, and so I'm going to have them introduce themselves here. But so first, we'll start with you, Jerry.
So I'm Gerald Patempa. I'm from XXL. I'm the risk engineering manager for property with EXA. I've been with them for about a little over 8 years now. I was in the structural engineering design world before that for about 22 years. And that's where I'm at right now.
Great. All right.
I'm Ray Obraki. I'm with the American Wood Council. Before that, I did 23 years in the Baltimore City Fire Department, where I retired as the assistant chief of the department, and I was the fire marshal. I was also the chief building official for a little city outside of DC called Rockville, Maryland. Currently with the Wood Council, I'm also the administrator of the Construction Fire Safety Coalition, which is a public-private partnership to reduce the severity and number of construction site fires. I also track construction site fires around the country to look for common themes, which there are many, and to look for different mitigation strategies.
Perfect. So Ray, with that point about some of the research you've done, could you elaborate a little bit about kind of the scope of the problem? How many construction site fires are we seeing, and what are some of the trends you're kind of seeing in your research?
The National Fire Protection Association, which you were an employee of, I believe, they did a study on construction site fires. So on average, this country gets 3,840 construction site fires a year. Another 2,580 fires that occurred during major renovations. So those sound like big numbers, thousands of fires a year. In the big scheme of things, it only makes up about 2% of total fires. The fire problem in the country is still single-family dwellings. But as Matt said, they are telegenic. They do a disproportionate amount of property loss damage. Also, the negative press that it garners for not just the community, but for the wood industry, for the construction industry. So that's basically the scope of the issue.
So in some of these presentations you've done, what are some of the findings or some of the things that, some of the takeaways that people were kind of surprised about? Well,
that report that I'm referring to cites cooking as the #1 cause of construction site fires, which seems to surprise some people. About 22% of the fires start that way. There's been a cultural change in the construction workforce where more employees want to cook on site instead of bringing their lunches or even going out for lunches. Now, 22%, if you look at that, it sounds like a big number. It is, but it's only responsible for 2% of the property loss. The two biggies are electrical fires and intentionally set fires. They make up about 25% of the fire causes, but account for 75% of the property loss.
Interesting. And so, Jerry, and so from your role, kind of in a risk control thing. So, what is like? How is your organization looking at construction fires, and what are you guys doing to try to mitigate those?
The biggest thing that we see on construction sites are combustibles, combustible loading, I should say. There's boxes and upon boxes of materials placed, on top of each other in corners out in the open. Some areas haven't been, open to all employees, so there's only a few employees up there. Another big issue is the placement of the fire protection system, whatever that may be, fire sprinkler, bucket of water, whatever at the time, right? So, we're always paying attention to smoking areas because with loading combustibles, they don't go together. Cardboard and flame obviously are a big deterrent, right? But the biggest thing that Ray has brought up that's actually piqued my interest is cooking. You walk through a giant construction site, you see what I call shanty town, where each sub or contractor has their own nice little wooden shed within, maybe inside the building or in the basement. And if you ever walked in those, you see microwaves and extension cords. But then you also see boxes of materials, and nobody really paying attention to anything. So Ray brought up a great point. That's going to be something that's going to be on my checklist for the future here, is to pay attention to that scenario specifically as far as cooking and what's happening in these little shanty towns that the workers are creating.
And the one point that you brought up that's a good point is, just because it's a non-combustible building, if it's steel or concrete, don't think it can't be susceptible to a construction site fire, because, as you said, there's packing material all over the place. There's cardboard boxes. They have vinyl tub kits. Even in concrete, cast-in-place concrete uses wooden forms. So there's always going to be combustibles on site, regardless of the type of construction. And in fact, a couple months ago, they had a big construction site fire in Brooklyn, New York, and that was a cement building. It went to 3 or 4 alarms.
Excellent. And so, Ray, I know in the past I've heard you refer to that the problem is not a lack of is kind of an enforcement gap. It's not a lack of codes. Can you explain a little bit about that?
A lot of people don't realize there are construction codes. There are building and fire codes that safeguard construction. Not a lot of people know that they exist or that they're enforceable and they have the force of law. But the problem is that traditional roles of building inspectors and traditional roles of fire inspectors leads to a responsibility gap. Like, building inspectors will go on site and, in their mind, we're going to look at the approved plans, we're going to see what's built, and we're going to apply those codes. You know, fire safety, that's the fire guys' stuff. That's under their responsibility. Well, the fire inspector says, well, hey, the fire code is a maintenance code. We inspect finished buildings. We don't go on new building sites. So in that gap are all these bad practices. I think that 100% of the construction fires that I have investigated or followed up with were predictable and preventable.
And so, Ray, could you speak a little bit more to the various different codes that apply and are really trying to address construction fire safety? So I'm thinking of like NFPA 241. Can you explain a little bit about that and some of the I codes, and try to, for those that may not be familiar with the various
Yeah, the two
codes.
major fire codes in this country, model codes that localities adopt, are NFPA 1 and the International Fire Code. And NFPA 1, Chapter 16, deals with nothing but fire safety during construction and refers to NFPA 241, which is less than 30 pages. The standard is less than 30 pages. It's an easy read. It's not technical whatsoever. And it's been around since 1933. But I guarantee you, less than 5% of the fire service even knows it exists, and probably none of the building departments. If you're in an International Fire Code jurisdiction, then it will be Chapter 33, which also refers you back to NFPA 241. So, I mean, if this is your industry, I don't know the ins and outs of underwriting and that kind of thing, but it would probably benefit people in this room to buy a copy of 241. Like I said, it's an easy read. It's less than 30 pages long, including the index, and it would give you a good roadmap on what a construction site, what should and shouldn't go on in a construction site. Excellent.
And so, yeah, that question comes up a lot. There's kind of questions around, well, which code applies and everything. So it really doesn't matter whether you're what's sometimes referred to as an NFPA state or an ICC state. They basically cross-reference each other. Yep. So it's kind of, from a code standpoint, they're trying to address the problem. Then it comes into the way the code is actually enforced. And so, Jerry, one of the key risks that comes up a lot of times is around hot work. And so could you, for one, explain what hot work is, and then perhaps speak a little bit to how hot work, some of the work you're trying to do and have used to try to mitigate the risks that are associated with hot work?
Sure. So most contractors have adopted a hot work policy program, which actually is a paper ticket that's generated that outlines the job hazard analysis of that hot work. Hot work is usually classified as anything that has to deal with a flame, grinding, soldering, heat treating, grinding. I know I'm missing a few, but anything that can generate a flame, a spark.
Torch applied roof systems.
There you go, yeah. So the basic program is, they're supposed to have a meeting with the two gentlemen. There should be two, one doing the work, one observing the work. There's a meeting that takes place. They fill out this nice little form. It gets put on the job board so that everybody can see what's happening in that area. Usually there's red tape or a curtain that might be used depending on the application that they're doing in the field at the time. And like I said before, there's one gentleman, doing the work, and the other one is supposed to be there monitoring. I think it's within a 35-foot circumference.
You're looking to
somewhere
see where
around
the
there.
slag goes and if it sets anything on fire.
Correct. But they have the fire extinguisher by them. A bucket of water is the new thing that I've seen on construction site. Gives you a quick douse of water before somebody can hit it with the actual extinguisher. This is always a point of contention, especially in insurance. As Ray probably can tell you, the 30-minute rule to me always seems a little slim. I have some contractors that have instituted 4 hours.
Well, the code says 30 minutes, unless it's a torch applied roof system, then it's 2 hours.
Correct.
But some places get one of those ultraviolet cameras to see if there's any hot spots before they leave. That's not required by the code, but it's above the code.
Right. But we've still seen instances where, like New York, we had the hospital roof fire where even the 2 hours wasn't enough, right? So it's always a point of contention. I don't think anybody can actually truly solve it. You can probably stay there all night to monitor it and still maybe have a problem later on. As Ray spoke earlier, a lot of the house fires, right? Things start up a day later, something just smoldering for a day over time. So,
And I would say a lot of the hot work being done does not have a fire watch. You just see the welder go in or whoever's in the hot work and just start, because construction managers hate paying a guy to stand there and do nothing. And according to the code, the fire watch should have no other duties. They'll want the person sweeping up or doing something else.
Right.
There's nothing a construction manager hates more than seeing a guy stand there not with a tool in their hand.
correct, yeah. There's that push-pull on a job site, obviously.
Well, and that's where it comes in, that some of this, there are best practices, there are things that perhaps the contractors that are kind of to the letter of the law or that they're following. But then there's also there's increasingly a lot more communities are starting to embrace or require some sort of hot work certification. So I know, for example, in Boston, they had a tragic line of duty death where 2 firefighters were killed. That was traced back to some welding that was going on outside the property. And so they've instituted, as I recall, a hot work certification process, and I believe that's been extended to the entire state of Massachusetts.
Yes.
But I think the challenge is again, if underwriters or other folks in the insurance industry aren't familiar with these kind of fire service specific type of legislation or requirements, they may not know to ask for that or to ensure that all the contractors. And so I guess the question would be is how do we build that knowledge in the insurance community of some of the best practices and the things that they should be asking their insureds for example, like a hot work certification for their subs or what have you. So Jerry, how do you guys look at these kind of requirements through the authority having jurisdiction, sometimes known as AHJ?
So I just became familiar with the Massachusetts thing. I was in my Uber this morning and I was actually reading upon the training and certification that is required in Massachusetts for that. Unfortunately, the balance of the insurance world, we're counting on the contractor to follow the codes that are enforced. I mean, that's really all we can do. We can just get confirmation from them that they're following these codes. And when we visit a job site, we do look for those specialized areas to make sure they're following those codes. And we're allowed to give recommendations or suggestions based on that. We can't really do more than that, right? We're putting the onus on them and the workers to make sure the job site is safe, basically for everyone from a fire situation.
I think the one thing the insurance industry could do is require a fire safety pre-incident plan, which the code requires, that's rarely ever enforced. The builder is supposed to sit down in conjunction with the local fire department and come up with a written plan that addresses several areas. Hot work's one of them. Electrical fire safety, site security is another one. If they just enforce that, that would raise the awareness. And because my audience is generally the fire service, I always say that the time and place is the pre-construction meeting. That's where you manage the builder's expectations about what you expect when it comes to fire safety. And until they get that building permit, they will give you their left arm. But once they can put a shovel in the dirt, then it's like pulling teeth.
Well, we do get a lot of that information up front. We do ask for it. And we don't always get it. Let me clarify that. So we do ask for, a logistics plan, site plan, shows us muster points, points of entry, gates, things of that nature. How are you protecting the public? When we arrive on job site, one of the big questions is, have you had a meeting with the fire marshal? Has he been out here? We don't necessarily get there when the shovels are just getting in the dirt. There's got to be some verticality or some spread for us to look at. But we do ask that question. Hey, has the fire marshal been here? Have they done any training here? That's an important feature, right? Especially with tower cranes now, that's all tied into each other. And do they have access? Where do they have access? When do they have access, right? Most of the times the response is they just come, they cut the lock, they're in. That's how it goes. And someone from the GC side is notified that there's an action item happening. So there is some correlation and coordination between the insurance world and the general contractor. But again, we can enforce it and make it a recommendation or a suggestion. Is about as far as we can go.
Well, you brought up emerging trends, and one emerging trend is intentionally set fires. And I'm not talking from civil unrest. I mean, they're just trending up, not including those types of civil unrest, arsons. So site security is taking on a bigger role. And in that report that I cited earlier, well, anyway, site security is taking on a much bigger role because it is trending upwards. And having a perimeter fence, well, the report said that most of the fires occur off hours. The vast majority of fires occur in the wintertime, off peak hours of work, obviously because nobody's there to catch it early on.
Right.
But with the intentionally set fires trending up, it reminds me of a story. I investigated a fire in Long Neck, Delaware, and the state fire marshal called it incendiary. It was intentionally set fire. They theorized somebody came out of the tree line, went into the back of this garden department under construction and set it on fire. It actually set a fire. Now that could have been for warmth. It could have been to burn insulation off a wire because they steal copper wire, or it could have been just that they were impaired and just set the fire. And I said, well, why do you think that? And he says, well, Long Neck, Delaware is the opioid addiction capital, basically, of Sussex County, Delaware. So I took that to a friend of mine who worked for Avalon Bay, and he said, oh yeah, in our risk assessment to see what level of security we need, we look at the CDC opioid addiction map from the CDC out of Atlanta as part of their evaluation on security. And I thought that was interesting that Avalon Bay did that.
Wow.
I didn't see opioids coming into this conversation, but here we go. So
I'm not a big fan of single factor analysis, so there's a lot of different things.
No, for sure. So, and so, Jerry, you were kind of saying about how we're now seeing more insurers, particularly builders risk folks, that are going out there and taking a more active role and sending risk control folks out there to go on site and to try to have a presence there and engage with the insured and make sure that they're kind of know that somebody's kind of keeping an eye on things. And so I imagine that it's kind of a approach where the largest risks and the largest exposures, those are presumably getting the most attention. But how are insurers looking at the smaller job sites? Are we seeing a trend in the market where those are also getting some engagement with like a risk control folks, like some of the folks that you work with?
I think it's a an 80-20 split, we'll call it. The smaller projects usually don't. But that again depends on construction type, right? You're going to pay attention to the ones that may have a larger footprint, but not the dollar value that follows. But they're, you know, the attention should still be there because you still have the same amount of activities going on, maybe just not in a giant vertical situation, but more of a spread, more of a spread area. But they still get the same fine-tooth comb in the beginning before they get insured. We're still asking for the same information we would for a high-rise. We want to know who the contractor is, their experience, logistics, site securities, what the geo looks like could be a good thing too. What natural perils lie within that area, because that can impede everybody, including the fire department. Site security, it's still the same. It's still the same checklist that gets followed. Are the site visits the same intensity? They are, but probably not as frequent. There may be, one or two versus 6 or 7, right? It just depends, I think, on the overall characteristics and who's involved.
Okay. Now, so Ray, one of the things in my 20 or so years in the fire protection field, I've noticed in the past, say, 5 or 10, there's been a real growing interest, particularly in the fire service, around construction fire safety. And so what are you seeing now in terms of the level of engagement and how local fire marshals, local other fire service folks are starting to ask questions and try to address this exposure?
Well, one problem is just the nature of how fire inspections occur. They're either complaint-driven or permit-driven. So if you go in and apply for a permit, that will trigger an inspection. If you get a complaint, that will trigger an inspection. But if you don't have a complaint, there's no permit for construction sites. So fire departments might not even know the construction site is there. So it's a mixed bag all over the country. Some departments have the bandwidth to have a unit go around and inspect construction, but that's rare. Fire marshals' offices are being cut all over the place because there's no political outrage when they cut fire inspectors, but there is when they close a firehouse. So there's an administrative barrier to enforcement, as well as the traditional role barrier to enforcement. But you have, like Worcester, Mass. Has a fire captain up there that literally goes around, checks every construction site, takes pictures, and sends them to the first due units. So when they had fire at one of the construction sites, that first due unit knew that the dry sprinkler system was in service. So they hooked up to the fire department connection, charged it, put the fire out 2 sprinkler heads, and it never made the news. And then on the other side of it, you have departments that never go on a construction site ever. And the first time they're talking to the construction manager is in the middle of the night, a 3-alarm fire.
That's a great point. And that's what, again, part of why I wanted to have this session was that we don't have a really good sense at this point of where mitigation is going on. And so again, as insurers are looking at potentially 2 very similar buildings, they may not know that the community and community A is taking this really aggressive mitigation-focused approach to reducing these potential for losses, and community B is just kind of like rolling the dice. So Ray, you brought up sprinklers, which are kind of the hot button topic when you get the whole conversation around construction site fires. So can you explain a little bit about how the code world and some of the code legislation has approached fire sprinklers in buildings under construction?
Well, the ongoing debate is, when do you turn the sprinkler system on? Okay, now the fire service would say, as soon as it's ready, you turn it on. Now the builder's going to say, well, I'm not turning it on until I turn the building over and it's commissioned, So, and geography has a lot to do with when you turn it on, but there is a common theme in buildings, a couple building big fires we had under construction where the sprinkler was in service but not turned on, and the building was completely closed up and conditioned. I can understand not turning it on when the building isn't conditioned because you got freezing pipes and all that good stuff. But once it is working, like we had a fire in Rockville, Maryland one time. It had a dry system in the roof. The fire started, went up into the roof, and it wasn't turned on. And it did like $30-some million of loss. It made CNN because it closed I-270, which is a major artery into D.C., and it was very avoidable. It also, if it had a guard service that was patrolling, they would have noticed the fire when it was still small. So I can't emphasize enough with the guard service being there, because we know the fires happen off hours, and a strong perimeter security would go a long way. And they actually have virtual technology now where you can have detectors that are Wi-Fi enabled, and they're portable, so you can take it from one construction site to the other. And because they're Wi-Fi enabled, they can send the alerts to anyone early on in the fire, because early detection is key. Early notification is key in keeping small fires small, because these fires get out of control very, very quickly.
Yeah, and part of that is because without lack of compartmentalization, I mean, it's basically like a stack of pallets at that point. And so Jerry, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Sprinklers and fire protection systems in buildings under construction are a bit of a double-edged sword. That obviously they're a key part of solving this problem in terms of if you have a functioning and commissioned fire sprinkler, most likely it's going to contain the fire small. However, there is a big caveat, a big asterisk. So could you explain a little bit about that duality, if you will? So
the asterisk would be in the insurance world is water is the new fire. That's the statement, right? The biggest headache on most job sites that I've heard about is knocked off heads, right? Nobody's really paying attention. Guys know the systems are charged, they're wet, ready to go. They still have that nice little yellow caution tape hanging from them, but somebody's not paying attention to the 12-foot ladder. So the next issue that we're dealing with is trying to come up with protocols and dealing with water issues, water release, I should say, water release. Not water inundation, but more water release issues where, we're asking contractors about blue bucket programs and mops and shop vacs and squeegees and et cetera. And then you get into the fact of, does someone know where the shutoff valve is? Something simple as that. Is there some signage? Is there a map? Do you have one guy on site or two guys on site that are taking care of floors and know where all the dials and valves and stuff are at? Because that's a huge thing. Like Ray said, you can turn on one little floor and then turn it off and you're done, right? Or in the case of a busted head, we're asking, do you simply just carry a guy's got wedges on the floors just to stick it up there just in case something happens, right? I mean, fire department probably still get called if it's a wet system.
Well, it depends if the sprinkler system has to be tied into the fire alarm system. So if a head activates, there's an alarm notification. And builders definitely do not want to ever turn the sprinkler system on before it's tied into that monitoring system, because if it happens off hours, a head pops or something, it's going to just run all night long. So right. Many of them, that's the sticking point. Well, it's not tied in, so we're not going to turn it on. Unfortunately, it usually doesn't get tied in until the very end of the job. It's like one of the last things to happen. Right,
and then that goes back to site security or somebody walking around, right? Is somebody else paying attention on the off hours or the weekends if work is not a 7-day job?
Yeah. But Jerry, that point about having asking questions around like, are they prepared for an accidental release or how to isolate a one wing or one branch of a fire protection system. Again, those, unless we're asking those questions, people may, a GC probably has, 100 things they're trying to juggle at any given time. And so they're probably not thinking about, hey, what I should prepare for an accidental discharge of this fire suppression system. But that's a great, so again, the more we can have carriers and other folks like asking these and kind of some of these best practices, we can potentially mitigate some of those extra water losses and hopefully curtail, because I know I've heard others say that they refer to water claims as death by 1,000 drips. And so, and again, this from the having come from the fire protection world, again, the focus is just put the fire out at all cost and all kind of urgency. And any investment in fire, like in fire prevention, fire suppression, is worth the investment. But again, I think there's an important counterpoint to this. And I think one of the other things is, and Ray, this is just a kind of aside, how could the insurance community get involved in some of these fire code legislation and some of the fire code development? How could, if someone's watching today and is interested, how could they, for one, learn about some of these codes that, like NFPA 241 or some of those, or how could they get involved in the actual development of those?
I'm actually surprised there's not more insurance industry involvement in the code development process, because it really touches a lot of what you do, not just during the construction of the building, but the life of the building. The International Code Council and NFPA are the two biggest code purveyors, I guess you could say, in the country. And anybody can apply to be on any of the committees. I'm actually on the International Fire Code Committee and on NFPA 241 and NFPA 1. It's the fire codes and the codes that govern construction. But even if you're not on the committee, they are open to the public. You can just get on the list and you'll get all the notifications for all the meetings. Some are virtual now. Well, many were virtual. Now they're starting to go back to in-person meetings, and they're going to have a hybrid. But anybody can get involved in any of these committees for either the International Code Council or NFPA.
And so you can actually review proposed changes to the text and actually submit changes. And again, you don't have to be a member of either of those organizations.
And these just aren't fire service groups. I mean, these are builders. These are like trade associations, wood, concrete, steel, gypsum, plus architects, engineers, design professionals.
Yeah, it's a great point. And having previously worked for NFPA, that was often a challenge, is getting more insurance folks engaged in that process, and if nothing else, aware of the process.
Well, the other option is, instead of investing insurance industry time doing it, there are fire consultants that can be hired that say, hey, listen, if you see anything that would affect us, if there's any codes that have a nexus with the insurance industry, let us know, and then we can talk about it.
Right.
It's not like there's not enough data out there or benchmarking that's been done, right, to tell us that.
So Ray, you talked about the enforcement gap as a gap between the building code official, so like the building department, and the fire code official, so like the fire marshal or fire inspector. But there also seems to be a gap between the local AHJ as being either of those, the building code official or the fire code official, and the insurers. In your travels and in some of the presentations you've done across the country, have you kind of come across best practices in terms of communities or programs that have kind of broken down those barriers where they've had the insured, so the insurer is kind of basically has a seat at the table in terms of trying to collaboratively reduce the risk of some of these large construction sites?
No, I've tried to get insurers engaged on this issue because it affects them, and I don't see any communities that bring them into, say, pre-construction meetings or any type of engagement by the AHJs or even the builders themselves.
And Jerry, from your side, now since you're having a lot of these meetings with your insurers, have you come across experiences where there's been a relationship, or they've had success in terms of reducing and mitigating that loss or the risk potential?
Yeah, especially on major mega products or mega projects, as we call them now. We're seeing billion-dollar values out there, over $1 billion, but they just started to peek their heads. So yeah, there's been more and more community involvement, municipality involvement, building departments, fire departments, especially on a lot of these bigger projects now. But I think the word has gotten out that the more people at the beginning, like Ray said, pre-construction, to delve into all the details, and get into the weeds if they need to, only assures that the project will be probably more successful than it was, if you just want to call it successful, without any incidents, right? You can probably call it being super successful and have no incidents whatsoever.
Well, it's the difference between being successful and being lucky.
That too.
There's probably a whole lot of constructions sites that are lucky that nothing happened. They didn't have a major loss, And so earlier we talked about the kind of the changing dynamic and the changing workforce that are the folks that are building some of these. And Jerry, in some of our calls a while ago, we were chatting about some of those dynamics. So what are you seeing in terms of labor shortages and the impacts on insurers and particularly the risk around fire with changing labor dynamics?
Well, there is definitely a labor shortage that's goes across North America that I know of for sure, here in the U.S. and in Canada. We're about 440,000 workers short. They're projecting that to hit a little over 600,000 by 2023, I believe, or 2024. Although the money's there for the North America to spend. The biggest problem, as you said then, is trying to find skilled workers to fill in the gaps. And contractors before never really had to worry about that, but as the generations retire, it's trying to convince the younger folks, the younger generations, to take over those spots. And the onus is or the urgency is really not there like it used to be. I'm probably showing my age, but when we were younger, our parents always said, "Hey, got to learn some sort of skill, no matter what you do later on in life. You got to learn how to pick up a hammer or screwdriver or something." I don't think the same impact is happening now, and we're going to come up to this point where hopefully we don't get to the robotic age. We might on job sites, but yeah, the labor shortage is definitely hitting everybody across across North America that I know of for sure.
In some of our previous conversations, we talked about that with the labor shortage, we're now where GCs might typically try to hire the A team, like the really skilled contractors and the really kind of the subs that they really have their act together. Now they're basically going to the B, C, D, and potentially even the E team of do you have anyone available? Can they do this particular trade? So how does that sort of start to affect if in a market where there is challenges around having enough labor help, that they may be cutting corners? And so how do you, as an insurer and as risk control folks, how do you try to mitigate potential shortcuts and that kind of stuff that might lead to these types of fires?
Well, GCs will never tell you you're going to get the A team, B team, or C team, right? You happen upon a job site, and that's the guys that are there is the guys you got. We do ask about training. How much training are you providing for these newer employees? I've seen on LinkedIn lately that there's a ton of new college kids graduating and going to large DC companies. But it all falls back on training, right? If you don't train them, they're not going to know. They're not going to know the best practices. Do they really want to learn? That's you gotta ask those questions ahead of time to make sure that the true interest is there. It's not just a job.
The training aspect is important, and I'm guessing you're talking about fire prevention training.
Everything all
because
encompassing.
I think because of the cultural change in the workforce, I think we overestimate the fire safety literacy of the folks on the job site. Like something as simple as dialing 911. We were raised to call 911 when there's an emergency, and we have people that are on job sites that came from countries where that just didn't happen. I'll give you a prime example. There was a fire in North Jersey where there was unpermitted hot work being done in a wall cavity. The workers hear crackling. Do they call 911? No, they go to lunch. So then they come back and they smell smoke. Do they call 911? No, they call their boss. Because from where they were from, you didn't call the government to come help you. You kept everything in-house. So the way the fire department was notified was that fire burned in that interstitial space until it burned through a sprinkler pipe. And then when a sprinkler pipe burned through, a water flow alarm went off. And that's how the fire department, but that was, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours into the fire. And by the time the fire department got there, it was game over.
So So earlier we were talking about kind of like whether robots are going to take over for labor, but I think it also brings up where does technology fit into this equation? How is there's innovation in technology that is being proposed to solve pretty much every problem we can imagine at these points. So how are you starting to see, and a key part of that is how do we start to vet the various different technology that is out there? So Jerry, how is AXA XL really trying to get their hand around what all this technology is, and what works and what may not actually meet the marketing gloss?
Understood. So funny you mentioned that. So AXA XL, a couple years back, established their own group called the Ecosystem. The ecosystem revolves around all the technologies that could be used on a construction site. We've even, this group has gone through I believe over 500 technologies that are out there, everything from water mitigation or water shutoff valves to wearables, simple things. And we've actually whittled that down based on continuous discussions, and we have an ambassador group within AXA and the ecosystem itself to pick out the best products and the ones that we feel are the best ones out there to actually help construction from certain exposures that might arise, from building to people. We've done our own vetting. We have our own partnerships. We encourage general contractors to use these products. And on their projects, there are a few GCs that have actually adopted a lot of these technologies and are just using them now without even us asking if they're using it. There's this nice little technology share that's happening across North America to help fires. Everything from fires to security, right? We have security cameras, carbon monoxide detectors, air pollution quality control detectors. There's a multitude of these little gadgets that can stick all over the place and are monitored just in one local spot.
Okay. And so can folks, could they find information about this on your website?
Yes, they can. They can go to AXA XL and type in ecosystem in the search box, and you'll find out all of the information that you need. We do have links to a lot of the products that are on there as well. If you're more interested to find out what's happening.
Excellent. So Ray, one of the questions that comes up, and I used to hear quite a bit, was somebody comes up with some new technology and then they want to go and get it mandated by the code and say like, oh, thou shall require this particular gizmo or gadget. And that often doesn't, it's not typically the way it happens. But so how does the code process in the fire protection community, they tend to be sort of conservative in terms of adopting new technology. So how does, so as new technology emerges, would that actually then integrate into like code mandates and that our communities might require?
Well, right now, that monitoring, the virtual reality, stuff, that's not required by any code. You'd be going over above the code. But I can tell you during the code development process, if I make something and I do the code proposal, everybody's going to look like, I'm trying to create market share for myself, which may be true, but doesn't mean it's not good technology and shouldn't be used. So if I were someone who had a company or I wanted these in the code, I would try to sell it on to a fire service organization to front that code proposal so it doesn't look like I'm just trying to grab market share and you have credibility.
Sure.
And the other thing is you have to have testing that goes on. I mean, if you show up at a code hearing without proper justification that this product actually does what you say it's going to do, then you better have it tested and you better have data because they're going to want to see the data.
And so as you talked about over and above the code, that's a question that comes up quite a bit is I think some people assume that the code is this aspirational thing of like, best wishes or what have you, like the things that we would all want to occur, but we know is not going to happen. But actually, the code is intended to be the minimum, if I understand it correctly. And so, so as an insurer, like it's kind of it seems like it's a little bit delicate balance of how much above the code or how much to require beyond what is the minimum. But I think at the end of the day, there's still we need to keep in mind that the code compliance is intended to be the minimum. Of like what is deemed kind of by industry best practice to be kind of like expectations. And so Jerry, can you speak a little bit about how do you guys and how does folks in the kind of more risk control world, how do you strike that balance between like how far beyond the code would you require? Is it something where you're like, well, this is the requirements that that our underwriting is gonna set and live with it, or is it, or do you have to kind of you have to make that delicate balance?
Well, I think it's a twofold. We realize it's the minimals, but also codes are written based on previous losses. Mm-hmm. That's where really the knowledge comes from, is what happened prior and what needs to now be instituted into the next code. That I guess that's the insurance world's fail-safe. My team of engineers we're either from an engineering background and or from construction, so codes are natural to us. We already know what takes place and what the code is asking for us. Do we like to see above code? Yes. Is the dollars always there? Probably not.
Sure.
And that again just depends on the building type, what's being built, and what technology you might want to throw into that.
Well, now, we're talking about going above the code. When I say that, it just follow the code. We're not getting code compliance now. So let's try finding, what happens if we get the builders to be code compliant before we try to go above the code that's not already being followed. And the code process has to be reactionary, in a sense, because a lot of these codes are costing people money, and they don't take that responsibility lightly. And there's a cost-benefit analysis in the folks that vote on these codes' minds. Is it worth it? And I couldn't tell you how many times I've heard at code hearings. This is a solution that's looking for a problem to solve. So unless you can demonstrate a problem or a need, they're just not going to throw it into the code because it sounds good.
Excellent. And so, Ray, as we wrap up, you mentioned in your introduction about how you oversee the Construction Fire Safety Coalition. So what is the goal or the kind of, what are some of the things that you try to take on and try to, how do you use that organization?
To raise awareness, share information. It's no magic bullet. We just try to exchange information. On the website, they have template fire construction safety plans. They have model policies for, say, phased occupancy, safety, because nobody wants to build an apartment building or a hotel and only occupy it when every single room is done. So there's going to be construction and occupancy at the same time. So it's sort of model policies. We have a program on hot work there. So it's a lot of just general information regarding construction fires that has been gleaned from a bunch of different stakeholders. And my experience is going around looking at the aftermath of a lot of these fires. But I did want to circle back to one thing about the worker shortage, is that translates into a more dangerous construction site, because housekeeping is usually the thing that it's the quickest to start failing. And if you don't have enough workers to build it, you definitely don't have enough workers to build it and then clean up as it's being built. And an accumulation of construction waste on the site is a factor in every single construction fire.
And placement of the waste.
And placement.
Yeah.
How far are the dumpsters, right?
Yeah.
Something
They're
simple
supposed to
as
be a
that.
minimum 30 to 60 feet away according to the code. I don't know how practical that is in infill lot sizes, especially in city centers.
Correct.
But certainly you want to try to get that construction waste off as soon as possible.
Excellent.
Agreed.
So as we wrap up, really, for one, I want to appreciate you guys both for being here. But again, I think the takeaway is that we're trying to identify that there's a lot of opportunities the more we can actually bring the fire protection world together with the insurance world. And as we mentioned, there's ways to do it through the code process. There's ways to do it through the like kind of initial meetings, like the planning meetings, as big sites are getting projects getting underway. And also as we, in forums like this, where we try to bring more fire people to engage with insurance folks, and whether it be underwriters or risk control folks, or and so I think there's really a common theme here, and really, again, it all comes back to that a lot of these losses, and the vast majority of these losses, could and should have been mitigated. These are known like points of failure. These are known causes of fires, and the more we can actually start to, and again, take a more joined up approach, we can actually start to really put a dent in these pretty significant losses, because while they make great 6 o'clock news kind of breaking footage, it really doesn't do anyone any favors. And again, there's a lot of potential loss and exposure here. So I really want to, again, thank you both for being here, and thanks for the opportunity to kind of talk about construction fire safety.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, yes, thank you.